It is reported that the rapper Tupac Shakur was in jail when he heard the song Who Shot Ya, written by his friend Notorious B.I.G. Little did we know at the time, but that song would become the official trigger of a musical conflict that would oppose the two coasts of the United States. Musical confrontation are recurrent in various musical cultures. The rivalry often pushes competitive artists to make sure they give their best and the artistic world benefits as a whole. However, sometimes the rivalry can be exacerbated and increase already existing tensions between defined factions or tribes. In this video, I will give 3 examples of how tribalism can permeate musical confrontation. I will give a summary of the cases, then I will draw parallels to explain why this phenomenon happens in the first place, what it tells us about society, and how it can estrange the closest friends and make them the worst enemies. Hello, welcome to the Botengu channel. How can I describe my content? Well, when I'm not making videos about music theory or of myself playing, I am using this channel as a way to reflect on what makes black musical cultures similar and also what makes each of them unique. Do not hesitate to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more. Oxford Languages define tribalism as the state of being organized into tribes. The word tribe is then defined more loosely. It usually refers to people from the same extended family, but it can also refer to people from the same geographical area, or simply to people with common interests. As I've done in some of my previous videos, when I observe patterns repeating in different black musical cultures, I tend to want to examine them. In this video, I will discuss the background behind each of the conflicts, then I will go in depth to describe the tribalistic phenomena that have come into play in those conflicts. During a session at the Quad Studio in November 1994, Biggie and Puff Daddy, rapper and owner of the Bad Boy label, invited Tupac to join. The latter was brutally shot in the lobby by thieves after having refused to give his jewelry. He survived, but because of a previous rape charge, he was thrown in jail. And it is in jail that he would hear the song Who Shot Ya by Biggie. The extremely mistimed release of that song was enough to make Tupac believe that Biggie and Puff were behind his shooting. He spent most of 1995 behind bars until the Compton-born and raised co-founder of Death Row Records, Suge Knight, proceeded to bail out Tupac under the condition that he releases a certain number of albums for him. And it was on. From that time, Tupac would release songs, a lot of which would be direct disses to the Bad Boy label and members. Soon, the New York solidarity would emerge as a response. You see, symbolically, Biggie was more than a talented New York rapper. He was the East Coast response to the increasing West Coast dominance on the hip-hop scene, embodied by artists such as Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, both members of Death Row at the time. For a lot of New Yorkers, rap was born in their city and it belonged to their city. Naturally, when Tupac was attacking Biggie, the Eastern solidarity quickly made it become, at least in appearance, a war between two coasts. Sadly enough, there were casualties in that war. Both rappers would die in similar drive-by shootings, Tupac in September 1996 and Biggie in March 1997. It was in 1997 that the group Wenge Musica from the newly rebaptized country DRC would be disbanded. From the disbandment, 2 major groups emerged: Wenge BCBG, led by Jimmy Piana, a group that would appeal to the higher class, and Wenge Musica Maison Mère, led by Werason, a group that would appeal to the lower class. Once the 2 entities were reinvigorated, the rivalry exploded. Fans could hear the 2 bands throwing subliminal and more open insult at each other as part of the titles of the album, the chants on the songs, and during the concerts, as well as during interviews. In 2002, an attempt at reconciliation took place in front of the ex-president Joseph Kabila. At the FICIN 2005, FICIN stands for International Fair in Kinshasa, both bands were scheduled to play on different stages on a Saturday evening. None of the bands wanted to stop before the other one. There were fights and gunshots heard on Jibe's side, and tear gas was thrown on the stage by local forces to end the concert. Werason was crowned the winner by the fans. Many have suspected that Wilson and his group were the ones to blame for the turmoil on Jibe's side. In total, the bands had played for more than 17 hours. In 2007, a new reconciliation was going to take place in which both bands were going to take turns on stage in the Stade des Martyrs. But due to the extremism of certain fans, the authorities could not ensure safety during the concert and cancelled it. Ever since, even if the artists have made peace and have been filmed multiple times with each other, the division is still present amongst the fans, and it'll probably stay that way forever. In the early 2000s, in Jamaica, the famous DJ Bounty Killer created a collective of musicians that he called the Alliance. Amongst the group, there was his lyricist Vybz Kartel. It is unclear how the relationship between Kartel and Bounty turned sour, but it did not help when Vybz Kartel was a guest at the wedding of Beenie Man, another famous Jamaican DJ. Throughout the 90s, Bounty Killer and Beenie Man had been rivals. It is thus normal that the killer was not happy to see his protege at the wedding of his rival, especially when his rival was marrying his ex-girlfriend. Vybz Kartel would then get kicked out of the Alliance, and tension would arise between Vybz Kartel and some members of the Alliance, like Movado, another Bounty Killer protege with whom Kartel had already collaborated. Vybz Kartel resented his activity to Waterford, Portmore in the St. Catherine parish. He would go on to name that community Gaza. He recruited some protege of his own and formed the Portmore Empire. The faction was opposed to Movado's territory, the Cassava Peace neighborhood, renamed Gully, in the heart of Kingston, in the St. Andrews parish. The war blew out of proportion and resulted in a lot of attacks on the streets. There was sort of a truce organized by the information minister in 2007, but the hostilities quickly re-began, and the rivalry culminated during their performance at Sting in December 2008. Sting is a famous Jamaican stage show which features dancehall artists who often come to clash. Overall, the Gully-Gaza war had so many disastrous consequences that both artists were convocated by the government to do a definitive truce. It was the then Prime Minister Bruce Golding who made them organize a peace concert in 2009. After that, the beef slowly died down. A few years later, Kartel would be imprisoned for murder, and Movado would sign on DJ Khaled's label, reducing the amount of time he spent in Jamaica. All of those conflicts happen in different contexts in different countries. There are some common truths to those rivalries. The music rivalries made people sell more. When two persons fight, it always makes people gather around. For example, the album All Eyes on Me, released by Tupac in February 1996, amid the East-West Coast War, became 5 times multi-platinum by April of the same year. Biggie's first album, Ready to Die, which contained the track Who Shot Ya, was certified gold 2 months after its release in September 1994. And by 1998, 1 year after his death, it was triple platinum. Jibin Piana and Wilson have both received Disque d'Or during their rivalry, and both of them have repeatedly filled a lot of European halls, like Bercy and the Zénith. When it came to the musical referendum in DRC in 2001, the two singers were number 1 or number 2 for most of the categories such as Best Artist, Best Group, Best Song, and Best Composer. When it comes to our Island Boys, Kartel was already on his way to become the new face of dancehall music, and his highly publicized feud with Movado made those two artists the biggest names in dancehall. The second common truth is that a musical feud makes people feel like they need to choose a side. The question that would normally be asked is, how much do you love an artist A and how much do you love an artist B? But now it becomes, who do you prefer between artist A and artist B? And it also becomes about your ability to show your loyalty to your favorite artist. Many rappers felt forced to choose between their love for Tupac and Biggie. When answering a question by Angie Rodriguez, Snoop Dogg expressed his love for both Biggie and Tupac. He was then snubbed by Tupac and other members of his label. It was reported that in Jamaica, DJs were prevented to play certain songs in certain neighborhoods, and people had to choose between Gully and Gaza. In the most extreme cases, that choice could have a fatal ending. In DRC, it was reported that families were separated just because the members had to choose between Werason and Jibin Piana. The third common truth in all of the three stories is their underlying tribal nature. An artist's fan base can be seen as a tribe. However, the interesting phenomenon that happened in those cases is that the musical confrontations have been permeated by tribal identities that had nothing to do with the musical conflict itself. Contrarily to sports teams, for example, that can represent a city, a singer is not representing any tribe in particular. So society can determine the nature of the tribe that the singer is supposed to represent, often based on existing ones. Often, this leads to the superposition of tribal identities, which can also be called multidimensional tribalism. And this will be discussed for each case.
In here, please take your hat off. At 7:03 p.m. New York time, 4:03 p.m. Las Vegas time, Tupac Shakur passed away, y'all. When the fuck are we gonna stop this bull and start loving one another? Don't believe the hype. It wasn't no East Coast, West Coast bullshit. It was some internal LA shit that took this brother out. Can we have a moment of silence for the memory of one of the greatest rappers that will ever live, Tupac Shakur?
In the early 70s, Raymond Washington and other South Los Angeles youngins formed the Crips as a coalition of multiple street gangs that allowed them to maintain a monopoly on criminal activity and spread the influence across low-income black neighborhoods. The street gangs, who were not aligned, were often the targets of the Crips. The non-aligned street gangs united as a response and named themselves the Bloods. With the import of drugs in the 70s and 80s, things changed for the worse, and those gangs became vessels of distribution for those drugs. Drug money was used to buy weapons that the gangs needed to get rid of competition and to protect themselves. Cities had neighborhoods divided into multiple corners, owned and controlled by different gangs. That was the case of the city of Compton, where Suge Knight was raised. He wasn't himself part of a gang, but most of his friends were. When he decided to create his label, he hired some of his friends from the Mob Pyro gang, a subgroup of the Blood. Suge Knight was known to bully executives of other labels so that they would give him their royalties and their material, or simply to get rid of the competition. According to multiple sources, that is what had Puff Daddy scared. And since the Death Row label was affiliated to the Bloods, Puff Daddy decided to get in contact with some Southside Crips and hired them to protect himself. Coincidentally, it was one of those Crips that Tupac assaulted after the Mike Tyson boxing match in September 1996. The same night, the Southside Crips would retaliate by shooting the car that contained Suge Knight and Tupac. Tupac would die of his wounds a few days later. The irony was that one of the Crips who was in the car with the shooter was Skiffy D, a childhood acquaintance of Suge Knight. Furthermore, according to Detective Greg Kading, Biggie's death was orchestrated by a Suge Knight's affiliate as a retaliation. What had started in the media as a musical conflict between West and East Coast ended up being permeated and brought to an end by a conflict between two Compton rival gangs.
Olongwi na Kinshasa okei na Equateur ozali na mboka na yo. Olongwi na ozali okei na Bazai ozali na mboka na yo. Baoyo balingi lisusu kotia biso na makambo ya tribalisme bolobela bango bino jeunesse non.
Due to the rural flight, the capital of DRC, Kinshasa, has welcomed many people from the different country provinces. Two of the most overly represented provinces have been Bandundu, partially inhabited by the people of what was once the Congo Kingdom, and Western Kasai, partially inhabited by the people of what once was the Luba Kingdom. Tribalism is a reality in Kinshasa, and it is common, for example, to solely recruit or promote based on tribal solidarity than based on true competence. Although both protagonists grew up in Kinshasa, they were born elsewhere. Jibin Piana was born in 1967 in the western Kasai province and is a member of the Luba tribe, whereas Werasan is part of the Mbala ethnic group and was born in 1965 in what would 1 year later become Bandudu province. The Mbala people are closely related to the Congo people. Now, it is important to mention that both musical bands were ethnically heterogeneous, and the leaders have never used their ethnic background to antagonize the opposite group. However, part of the media did, and part of the media made the band leaders poster children for their respective ethnic groups and their province of origin. For example, during the height of the conflict, columnists who were from the Bandudu region had no problem lying just for the sake of promoting Werasan's performances. And many people felt the need to support one singer solely based on his ethnic background.
J'aime bien JV, je suis Moulouba, j'aime bien JV. Je suis obligée d'aimer JV, mais Werasan, il a bien chanté, là c'est sûr.
The ethnic interpretation has had some violent repercussions. For instance, La Voix du Congo reports that in 2002, Werasan's fans went and attacked two media personalities from the Kasai region. And once again, despite not being as deadly as the first case study, tribal divisions unrelated to music have also been able to creep up in the musical conflict.
Me love me like PMP. Me love me like this a manly now. Put up your one if you love manly. Chocote rocking in a category. Lord of East.
The Cold War has polarized politics around the world. In third world countries, it was frequent that a pro-US government would be opposed to a more socialist one. Jamaica was no exception to that. The difference is that in Jamaica, there were already a lot of violence between supporters of the two different parties. And when the CIA decided to support militarily the Jamaican Labour Party, led by Edward Seaga, to discredit Michael Manley's People National Party during the 70s, it contributed to increasing the already existing violence between the two existing voting groups. Both parties resolved to make deals with local gang leaders. The gang would have the support of the state, while in exchange, the politicians knew that the neighborhood was going to vote for them. Those neighborhoods were managed not by state law, but by the gangs, and those neighborhoods were called garrisons. The situation got even bloodier when the local gangs developed into international drug trading gangs during the cocaine era in the 80s. The famous drug lord Christopher Coke was affiliated with the GLP party, and it would be him and the Prime Minister Bruce Golding in 2009 that would encourage Vybz Kartel and Mavado to bury the hatchet. To show how things had evolved, in 1978, it was Bob Marley, an artist, who was trying to unite two political opponents, Seaga and Manley. And in 2009, it was a politician who was trying to set a truce between two artists. Although the government-mandated peace treaty could prove the lack of affiliation between Jamaica's political history and the dancehall beef, history has shown us that profound tribal divisions tend to align closely with musical ones. There are no explicit ties between the music sides and the political parties, but I'm going to go ahead and suggest this. The political war that had started in the 40s between the two parties has helped shape the Gully versus Gaza conflict at different levels. First, the political history has ingrained the idea of rivalry and the need to plead allegiance to a tribal leader into people's consciousness. And those ideas were then easy to transpose into a musical conflict. As the author and social commentator Caroline Cooper says, "We're so accustomed to the tribalization of politics that we carry the either-or mentality even into entertainment." Second, there's a possibility that the geographical territories of the Gully-Gaza war have been inherited from the ones of the political division between JLP and PNP. As Sally Gold Taylor notices in her PhD, interestingly named Bullets and Badges. The maps shown display the neighborhoods of Gaza and Gully, superposed over the maps of the electoral repartition of Jamaica's votes for the four elections between 2002 and 2016. The maps clearly show that the Gaza region is a faithful PNP supporter, while the Gully region is a faithful JLP supporter. Would the feud have had the same impact if both the Gaza and the Gully region had the same political allegiance? That would be interesting to find out. I will leave you with some final thoughts concerning tribalism. The Rwandan President Kagame has stated that tribalism can destroy nations, and in regards to his country and what happened during the 90s, he surely knows what he's talking about. However, I take objection. Nationalism doesn't shelter us from more destruction than tribalism. The 20th century has 2 world wars to back up my claim, and nationalism can even be seen as a form of tribalism. As long as people have identities to which they cling, there will be war. Hence, I have no issues when, for example, Africans cling on to their ethnic tribal identities. They are what I refer to as coherent identities, while the national identities in Africa are colonial legacies. The real issue is not having a tribe. There have been several cases where an empire or a kingdom has sheltered many tribes or castes without resulting in complete chaos. The real issue is bipartition. Bipartition refers to the act of being divided into 2 parts. Bipartition is what leads to polarization and violence. Whether we're talking about 2 gangs sharing 1 city, 2 political parties sharing 1 country, or 2 overly represented ethnic groups in 1 city, bipartition will lead to war. There's also something really interesting that can explain the superposition of tribal identities in the case studies. In machine learning, to classify data, many techniques require us to find the line that divides the data points the best. When the bipartition line is not well placed, there is often more distance between the points of the same class than there is between the point of different classes. Therefore, many machine learning algorithms will move that line until it adopts a position that maximizes the distance between the 2 classes and minimizes the distance between the points of the same class. The West versus East conflict didn't really make any sense, since Tupac had been partially raised in New York, and since many West Coast artists wanted to collaborate with East Coast artists, and vice versa. The bipartition line wasn't well placed yet. It had to move until it found a better location. It positioned itself so that it would divide the 2 artists based on their direct or indirect allegiance to the Bloods and the Crips. And as we saw, the consequences were deadly.